Hello, my name is Ria, and today I'll be presenting to all of you my new proposal for a new international auxiliary language, Zazz, as my entry for the second annual Cursed Conlang Circus. This is Zazz by Ria Dawn for Agmashwa, or as they'd say in Zazz. So what is Zazz? Well, as I said before, it's my new proposal for an international Orcs lang. It is a conlang with vision, It brings together the two most prestigious fields of study in the multiverse, music theory and conlanging, of course, as you'd all know, no doubt. It has the most refined inflectional grammar ever seen, even better than Germanic or Slavic languages, let me tell you. It brings new methods of high-level engagement with the field of lexico-linguistic curation, and not only supplies inverse reactive current for its use in unilateral phase detractors, but is also capable of automatically synchronizing cardinal gram meters. So we'll have a look at the phonology quickly. As you'll see, it's a bit confusing at first, and that's because Zazz doesn't really use consonants and vowels like our normie spoken languages do. You see, it uses a combination of these quote-unquote consonants you see here, which I'll explain later, and pitches in the 24-tet tuning system. Now, 24-tet is 24-tone equal temperament, and that basically means that Zazz works with about twice as many notes as a piano does. If you've ever heard of, what's its face, sol re, sol, fa, sol, whatever it's called, that conlang, where it uses pitch and music and melodies to indicate words. It's similar to that, except, better in every imaginable way. Anyway, from the phonology, we've got these basic phonemes here, but we've also got, some suprasegmentals equivalent to tone in a tonal language. So each word can be major, minor, diminished, augmented, or neutral. And we don't just have quality as a suprasegmental, chordal quality, but we've also got articulation. So every word can either be staccato, which is short, plain, or legato, which is, flowing and graceful. And this also, because Zazz has the best inflectional grammar ever seen, that also affects the rest of the clause. We'll get to that later, just trust the process. But we don't just have suprasegmentals, we've also got phonological hypersegmentals, which the only one of which is extension. So you know how chords in music can have extensions. You can have a C, just a C major, then you can have a C major 7, then a C major 9. That's what this is, and we basically use the different extensions to mark case. We'll get to case later, just trust the process. We've also got, not just suprasegmentals and hypersegmentals, but also post-segmentals. One of these is style/instrumentation, so every verb can take one of these styles that I've got listed here, or instrumentations, however you want to define it. And that's basically how the clause that the verb is in sounds. We'll get to that later. There's also rhythm, so every noun has an inherent rhythm. It can either be plain or drunk. We'll get to that later. We've also got tempo, so at the start of every sentence, someone will announce their tempo via use of a metronome, and then throughout the sentence, depending on verbs and conjugation and all that stuff, the tempo can change according to those little things I've defined there. There's also dynamic, which is the volume of the music, so it can either be quiet or moderate or loud. Anyway, so we've gone through all these different segments, the post segments, the hyper segments. What do these all mean? Well, I've made a nice little intuitive table here for you to see how all of this works together. As you can see, the different features have a very complicated agreement system. So as you can see here, melody, every word has its own melody, and that doesn't affect other words, but every word also has its own key, and key does affect other words. As you can see there, it affects the entire clause. Same with articulation and rhythm. And then tempo, style, and dynamic, well, those aren't inherent to nouns, those are inherent to verbs. So you can see, not only do you have to agree the entire sentence to the noun that you're working with, but also you have to agree the entire sentence to the verb. It's a very refined conjugation system. So let's just go over melodies quickly. Every noun, modifier, and verb, those are the three basic word types, has its own unique melody. This is the primary lexical trait of each word, so that's basically how you tell them apart. For nouns and verbs, the melody is played relative to their underlying chords, so depending on what key a given clause is in, the melody can change pitch, but as long as the contour stays the same, then you've got it. It's like tones, there's not a definite note that you have to hit to have a high tone. It's just the contour, basically. Modifiers don't possess underlying chords, whereas nouns and verbs have their own inherent chord. Modifiers don't have that, so they just take the they just take the chord of whatever they're modifying. And the last way that melody comes into effect is if you want to put a noun into the plural, you just play the melody in parallel octaves. So as you're probably getting, this is a very intuitive musical system of language that we're getting into, and it only gets simpler from here. We've also got prosody, so like we have in English, questions are marked by a falling off of pitch at the end of the phrase. So if I asked a question in Zazz, it would take this prosody. So if I asked a question in Zazz, it would take this prosody. Have you gone to the store today? Commands, meanwhile, are marked by a sharp sliding up in pitch at the end of a phrase. So get over there. So we've been over the phonology, we've got all these different phonological processes going on, and I think now it's time that we get into the grammar, So as I said before, every noun has an inherent melody, key, quality, attack, and rhythm, though the latter is only expressed in its influence over the accompaniment of clauses. Additionally, the articulation and extensions, the latter of which is dependent on the chord's quality, may be altered as inflections to mark grammatical case, like I said before. As you see, we've got basically the standard array of cases. We've got direct, ergative, accusative, dative, and genitive. They've merged due to phonological processes. We've also got instrumental, locative, causative, purposive, the inchoative verbalizer, the kin proprietary, the circummissive, the privative, the semblative, the diminutive. We've got all of the standard cases, so this isn't too interesting. We've also got verb morphology. As I said before, every verb has an inherent melody and style. Additionally, the dynamic of the clause can be changed to alter the meaning of the verb by adding or lessening intensity. So if you say run very quietly in Zazz, then that means that you're running without much, maybe not much intent or not very quickly. Whereas if you say run, then that means that you're running, quite quickly or maybe with a lot of intent. It just changes the meaning like that. As I said before, the tempo of the clause also changes to agree with the agent of the verb, first, second, third person. We can also verbalize nouns using a very simple method described here. Now we move on to the inflectional morphology. So you can see here just a table of the different extensions that nouns take in different cases. And you see it varies depending on the quality of the noun. Like I said before, they can take major, minor, diminished, augmented, and neutral. And since, diminished and augmented sevenths are kind of weird with those things, and certain extensions don't work the same way, so a lot of cases sort of become ambiguous depending on the quality of the chord. So as you see here, diminished nouns don't have a difference between ablative and terminative case. Augmented nouns don't have a difference between dative and ablative, and neutral nouns don't have a difference between direct and privative. But this doesn't really tend to be a problem, as I'm sure you can guess. Here's a little bit more information on the modifiers quickly. They're just melodies with no underlying harmony. The different varieties of modifiers are not differentiated from one another, but the key in which the modifier's melody is played agrees with the tonic of the word it's modifying, so they can be distinguished this way. Modifiers agree with the clause in the same ways as all other words. So just back down to, the basics, the very basics. A phonological word in Zazz must have a melody, an attack, and an articulation, but that's not inherent to it. On top of this, nominals, so pronouns and nouns and demonstratives, must also have a rhythm and a key, whereas verbs must have a style. They've also got a tempo, a dynamic, and a key. Let's get on to the syntax now. This syntax is pretty basic. It's a strict SVO word order. Modifiers are placed at the end of the clause in the same order of appearance as the words in the preceding clause that they're modifying. So if you've got a fat dog and a black cat, you'll say that you've got a dog, cat, fat, black. The thing about objects is that they can't be modifiers. They have to be nouns or pronouns or demonstratives. So copular constructions like they are angry are translated as they're an angry one to preserve this rule. Also, every transitive clause must have an object, although the subject can be implied from time to time. We'll get to that later, just trust the process. Now we get on to clauses, relative clauses and such. Relative clauses are indicated by a melodyless secondary dominant preceding the subject. Quotations are indicated by a secondary 2-5 preceding the subject, and clauses linked by causation, so like this happens, therefore this happens, they are linked to the main clause by a secondary 3-6-2-5-1 preceding the subject. Possession is indicated by the juxtaposition of the possessor in the dative/genitive case. Obviously, it's the genitive case, but as I said before, they've merged due to regular phonological processes. The possessor in the genitive case is immediately prior to the possessed thing. Basically, depending on the verb, an SVO, a standard transitive SVO sentence can take one of these chord progressions that I've got listed here. It's got a pretty standard array of tenses. It's got the negative, the past perfective indicative, the past imperfective indicative, the present indicative, the future indicative, the perfect imperative, the imperfect imperative, the habitual, and of course the reflexive as its own tense. A lot of people might take issue with this as like, oh, that's too complicated. Most languages, even like Mandarin, doesn't have that complex of a tense system. So how can this be an international auxlang? And to them I say, trust the process. Now, you'll notice by now, you might have noticed that there's this strict word order. So how do we deal with multiple objects? So like, what do we do with I give him the bread? How do we deal with sentences that have multiple objects like that? And how do we fit them into the inflectional agreement system? Well, what we do in these cases is we state the clause with just the direct object as per usual, and then restate the verb and add the other object after it, with the verb now agreeing with this object instead of the direct object. So they gave me water would literally be they gave water gave me. They hit it with a rock would be they hit it hit rock. Now you could argue the rock in that last example isn't really taking the object position, and to that I say trust the process. Now, if you've been paying attention this whole time, you'll notice that the key of the entire clause is determined by the object. So what do you do with intransitive clauses that don't have an object? In these cases, the key of the subject is taken to be the key of the clause. Usually this means that the subject will not end up being played in its own inherent key, despite the clause key being said key, as subjects rarely take the one, as discussed in the verbal inflection section. Finally, we move on to the written language. The written language is pretty simple. So basically, nouns are written in Latin characters in the Petaluma font, which you might recognize as the jazz sheet music font, whenever possible, basically. Attack and rhythm are marked via diacritics. Melody is shown via superscript scale degrees based on the word's tonic, and pluralization is shown via italics. Articulation isn't written, that's just, implied by context. Verbs are written with Cyrillic characters in Comic Sans because Petaluma doesn't support Cyrillic characters. Diacritics are added in order to represent style and dynamic. Attack is not written, that's just implied from context. Ignore the fact that neither of the above fonts have good diacritic support, just trust the process. So we see here, I've got a little table here showing how you'd notate just a plain C major chord with different attacks. So your soft attack, that's like a v, that just has a little ditty on the bottom. Then moderate attack, that's just that doesn't have anything. Then hard attack, which is that's got a little on the top. And if you want to make the rhythm of the noun drunk, then you add a little on the top. So just like that, you see, it's a nice little table, and these are all of the diacritics you'll see on nouns. And it's a similarly simple process for adding diacritics to verbs, as you'll see in this table. Different dynamics are marked with different diacritics, and different styles or / instrumentations, however you want to define it, are marked with different articulations, different diacritics as well. You're wondering how do we work with the modifiers then? We've got the nouns and the verbs. What about the modifiers? Well, the adjectives are written in the Hebrew alphabet. Melody is again written in superscript, scale degrees based off the implied tonic, represented by the fundamental grapheme, which is the closest Hebrew equivalent to the English letter that would represent that chord. The number of dots beneath the character is indicative of which noun it's modifying in terms of its position within the preceding clause as the first, second, third, etc. If there's only one thing that's modifying, then that's not included. Adverbs are much simpler. This will be a breath of fresh air for everyone. They're written in their direct American English translations, approximately transliterated into Elder Futhark. Sadly, there's no standardized system for this approximate transliteration, but just trust the process, all right? A few last things on the written language. Metronome strikes are written as separator strikes are written as and contra-expectational rim shots are written as The name of the language is simply written Zazz. So if you ever happen to write down Zazz in Zazz, you don't spell that how you say it. You just write Zazz in Petaluma. Just trust the process, So now that we've gone through all of the grammar and the written language, we can go to the example text. So, according to all known laws of aviation, there's no way a bee should be able to fly. Its wings are too small to get its fat little body off the ground. The bee, of course, flies anyway because bees don't care what humans think is impossible. If we do the interlinear gloss here, we sort of separate it out. We adapt it for the case system of Zazz and also the lexicon because there's a few small differences between English and Zazz lexicon. And the things in brackets are either implied rather than said, or they're non-lexical. So if we just write out the chord progressions for all of this, I've written them in I've written each clause in alternating colors because otherwise I wouldn't be able to tell which one's which. And I've just written them out like that, gotten all the chord progressions from what, the tenses of the verbs are. Since this paragraph is stating just, generic fact, most of the verbs are in the habitual tense. Now, if we look at all of the nouns, we can figure out the keys for all of these chord progressions, as well as, the secondary dominants and secondary 3, 6, 2, 5, 1s, etc. Then we can go through and add the rhythm and tempo alterations where they need to be said. Everywhere else is just implied plain or moderate tempo. Then we can notate the style that each clause is going to be in accordance with the verb as we went through earlier. And then finally, we can write it down. So this is what the example sentence would look like written down in Zazz. And I'm going to read that out aloud to you in just a moment. But first, I'd like to say thank you for listening to my presentation. And I'm hoping that, Agma Schwa and the United Nations both like my idea for this international auxiliary language. So thank you for your time, and I'll see you tomorrow.